Hi, I'm Adam Porter and this is my board gaming vlog, and today I'm talking about solitaire gaming, so board games that you can play on your own. And this seems to have been a recent, something that has really blossomed over recent years. I think when I first got into the hobby, there weren't that many solitaire games around, and many of the games on my shelf, older games, don't have a solitaire mode in there. What I'm noticing now is that games coming out very frequently do have a solitaire mode, even where it wouldn't naturally be obvious that such a thing would fit. For example, recently I was looking at the game Gorus Maximus, which is a multiplayer trick-taking game. And normally trick-taking games don't even play with two players, let alone playing with one. And yet Gorus Maximus has a very simple little single-player experience, which you're not going to buy the game specifically to play Gorus Maximus one player, but it's nice that it has that feature. I incorporated a solo mode into my game Quazzle that came out with the Happy Puzzle Company earlier this year. Now, Quazzle is a puzzle, but it's a puzzle that you play against an opponent. You race against an opponent. And so when you take away that opponent, of course, you have to find some other way to incorporate tension into the game. The great thing with Quazzle is that every puzzle is sort of randomly generated by laying out cards, so you get a very variable sort of system. But you're also racing against time, and so that adds the tension where the other player wouldn't be. The Happy Puzzle Company has quite a lot of different puzzles which can be played solitaire. So, for example, the Genius Square and Chroma Cube and 30 Cubed and Face to Face. These are all good solo puzzles. And actually, I have a solitaire puzzle coming up with them later in the year or next year, which is specifically designed for a single player and can't be played multiplayer. I've also been dabbling with design of a solo mode in a much bigger strategy game. So a sort of 1 to 2 hour strategy game can be played up to 6 players. How do I get something like that same sort of experience with a solo player? So really, this video is looking at all those sort of factors that you consider when you're making a solitaire game, whether that is something relatively simple, whether it's something that's designed specifically for solitaire, or whether it's adding a solitaire mode into an otherwise multiplayer game, or maybe something of a high degree of complexity and trying to sort of mimic an opponent through some sort of artificial intelligence system in the game. So let's start off simple with solitaire puzzles. There's a fantastic range of puzzles by a company called Smart Games. These have predetermined puzzles, usually in a small booklet, and you work your way through them from easy difficulty to the most difficult to sort of, genius level, and they can be extremely challenging. Smart Games is a range of single-player puzzles with beautiful components and ingenious challenges which range from very simple for young children to extremely challenging even for the best adult puzzlers. And the range is vast, and most sets contain between 60 and 120 puzzles. In Jump In, the player has to get all of the rabbits into holes. The rabbits can only move by jumping over obstacles. The toadstools can't be moved. And in later puzzles, foxes are introduced, which can be slid around on the grid. The board is cleverly designed so that the movement of the foxes is restricted. And even in such a childish-looking game, the puzzles are very, very hard when you reach the expert or master or the wizard level. The game packages up neatly with a transparent plastic lid. So moving away from totally solitaire puzzles to something that is a multiplayer game but can be played with a solo mode, sometimes, particularly with the very simple games that have a solitaire mode, they can feel really quite puzzly. Okay, despite not being a puzzle. Something about losing the social interaction of having other players around the table emphasizes or highlights the more abstract nature of these sort of games that we play. Suddenly you realize that actually what you're doing is moving cubes around on a board or little wooden pieces and raising your markers on various tracks or pulling various levers to make the game work. And those things don't immediately leap out at you when you're having lots of social interaction and fun with other people, but when you're very focused, that really comes to the fore. In Las Vegas, each player competes to have the most dice of their colour on a casino and win the money cards that are placed above. On a player's turn, they roll all 8 dice in their own colour. They sort these by number and add all dice showing one number to the corresponding casino. The next player then takes their turn, rolling all of their dice. So the sequence continues with players re-rolling each turn and occupying the casinos. At the end of each round, each casino is checked, and wherever 2 or more players have an equal number of dice, those results are ignored, meaning that a player who has fewer dice at that location can take the prize. After 4 complete rounds, the player with the most money wins. The expansion, Las Vegas Boulevard, offers up a solo mode. 64 dice are used, so there's 8 sets of 8 dice each, and the player chooses a colour to be their own. Here I'm playing as white. One colour is rolled and positioned on the board, and the remaining dice are split into 2 groups, and then the game begins. The solo player rolls 1 die of each colour remaining in the pool, using all dice from the first group. As in the standard game, they then place all dice of 1 number onto the casinos, but unlike the regular game, these dice will be of different colours. This is repeated over and over until the entirety of the first group has been placed. The player then moves on to the second group and repeats the sequence. And when all dice have been placed, the casinos are scored as normal, with tied colours being discounted just as you'd expect. The solo player compares the money that they have gathered to the total money gathered by all the other colours combined. And if the solo player has more, then they win the game. Now, Las Vegas Boulevard, I hadn't played the solitaire mode before last week when I started thinking about this video, and actually it was a real highlight of all the games that I've sort of explored over the last week, and there's been a lot of them. There's going to be a lot of examples in this video. Las Vegas Boulevard was one of the real highlights. I thought that was a great solitaire mode. It felt very much like the main game. It was simple, it was challenging, there was a good degree of randomness and tension in there, and I really didn't know whether I was going to win or lose. So very satisfying game, Las Vegas. If you can get hold of the expansion, Las Vegas Boulevard is one of the best expansions I have for any of my games. It doesn't just add a solo mode, it adds so much to that game, so many different modules, all of which are really, really fun. Another way of incorporating randomiser, of course, is to have a deck of cards, and this is the way Tiny Towns, which is another quite puzzly game, does it. In Tiny Towns, every player is building their own town by placing wooden tokens and attempting to fill their grid. Each turn, one player will call out a colour, and every player then takes one resource of that colour and places it onto their own grid. When a player has made a pattern as indicated on one of the building cards, they declare it and place the building on one of the spaces occupied by one of those resources in that pattern. The other cubes are then removed. The game ends when no player can play because all grids are filled or blocked. And players score according to the criteria on the building cards, which are different in every single game. For example, the bakery is worth 3 points if adjacent to a red or black building. The inn scores 3 points if not in a row or column with another inn, etc. The solo mode works exactly the same way, except the resource is not called out by a player. Instead, 3 cards are drawn from the resource deck, and the player chooses one of those to place. At the end of the game, you score as normal, and then you compare to the rulebook to see how you've done. So Tiny Towns was never a particularly interactive game, even in its multiplayer version. Yes, the other players, they pick a colour and everybody has to place that colour, so it's a little bit like a bingo type system. But they can't directly influence what you're putting on your board. All they can do really is limit your choices, and of course that limitation can be equally well achieved just by turning over cards from a deck. And so Tiny Towns works quite well in a solitaire sort of system, albeit it's a fairly sort of repetitive sort of puzzle when you play it more and more, and when you lose that human interaction. Another factor that you need to think about in solitaire design is what are your win conditions? Because obviously in most games our win condition is we need to beat our opponent, but we haven't got any opponents, so what could our win condition be? And in a lot of games it's as simple as beat your previous highest score. This is particularly true in games which are generally quite sort of multiplayer solitaire. So I mean games where other players don't interact with you too much. You see it in a lot of roll and write games. So games where I'm writing on my own individual sheet and no one else can reach over and write on it. They're writing on their own sheet, doing their own thing. So a really good example would be the game Cartographers. And this one I thought was particularly notable because it was a solo mode where there's no change to the components, no added components. Everything needed for the solitaire mode is very carefully and subtly incorporated into the cards that you use in multiplayer, which I thought was a really nice touch. In Cartographers, players are creating maps under instruction of the Queen. The player who discovers the most desirable lands, and hence gains the most victory points, wins. Each player has a blank sheet and a pencil. And 4 cards are laid out on the table representing special scoring opportunities. So in this example, players are trying to earn 8 reputation points for each cluster of 6 or more village spaces. For this one, they're going to earn 6 points for each complete row or column they filled out on their grid. Here they'll score 1 point for each forest adjacent to the edge of the grid, and here they'll score points for having water or farms adjacent to mountains. Each turn, 1 card is revealed, indicating a terrain type and a shape that a player must draw on their map. Often there's a choice to be made. Ruins cards indicate that the shape must be drawn over a ruins icon on your sheet. Monster cards allow you to draw a shape in the most awkward spot on your opponent's sheet. And if you surround a mountain, you gain gold, which gives you points at the end of each round. A round ends when a set total is reached by adding up the numbers at the top of the revealed cards. And at the end of the round, representing a season, the players score points according to 2 of the scoring cards laid out at the start of the game. In spring, the cards A and B score. In summer, cards B and C score. In autumn, it's C and D. And in winter, D and A score. And players additionally lose points at the end of each round for any monsters that they have on their board which have not been totally surrounded. After 4 seasons, the players total their victory points and the highest scorer wins. In the solo mode, the only change to gameplay is when ambushes occur. Each ambush card has an icon in the top corner indicating where to start considering placing your monsters. So you search from that spot around your grid looking for an appropriate space in a clockwise or anti-clockwise direction as indicated on the arrow at the bottom of the card. When you score your map, you subtract the numbers shown on the scoring cards to give your total, and then you compare it to the rulebook to see how you've done. Of course, I could have used many different roll and write games for this example. I could have used Welcome to Your Perfect Home. I could have used Ganz Schön Clever. All of these have a system where you try and beat your previous highest score, and often you achieve some sort of rank, some sort of criteria, and then if you can push your score up higher, you get a better rank, and so next time you try and get better, and that's the way the game works. But there's not much narrative involved, and actually one thing that I've found is really fun in a solitaire game is if there is a little bit of an element of story. So the game D-Day Dice was a particular highlight, and actually D-Day Dice I played a number of years ago several times as a solitaire game, which is uncommon for me. But recently I've got it out again, and I still found this one really tense. In D-Day Dice, you're trying to beat the scenario. You're not trying to beat your highest score. So there's a whole range of scenarios in there. I suppose it's equivalent to something like those smart games where you've got that booklet of increasing difficulty. So D-Day Dice has predetermined scenarios, but there is randomness and tension there because we're rolling dice. In D-Day Dice, 1 to 4 players each represent a unit of soldiers advancing up a beach in World War II. It's a cooperative game. Players select a map and place their dice to act as markers, indicating their position on the beach. The aim is to progress up the beach and into the bunker. And on a player's turn, they roll 6 dice, they lock 2, and then they get 2 more rerolls for the remaining dice. They can amass soldiers and stars, which are spent to purchase specialists, which have ongoing abilities, or tools, which are spent to purchase items, which have one-off abilities. And they collect courage, which is spent to advance up the board. Getting a matching set of red, white and blue dice gives additional rewards, and skulls negate other results. A full set of all 6 results gives a random award, which is drawn from the deck. And at the end of each turn, the unit loses soldiers equal to the defense value of the sector. Sometimes this is made worse by machine gun fire, which adds a 6-sided dice roll to the defense value of that sector. And different sectors have different effects. They might award you specialists when you arrive, or they might prevent you using items, or moving through minefields might cause you to lose soldiers, etc. Later scenarios introduce more advanced specialists, more advanced items, and even vehicles. The solo mode is exactly the same as multiplayer, except that the solo player gains rewards which would normally be allocated to their teammates. The game also has a victory point system, so that a solo player can replay the same beach over and over again and try to beat their previous score. Another way that you could add tension to your game and also have a different end game condition is to race against the clock. And this is particularly apparent in the solitaire mode for Magic Maze. Magic Maze is an incredibly interactive game, one of the most interactive games that I've got in its multiplayer mode. So seeing that in solitaire mode is a bit of an odd experience. Let's take a look. The players are trying to get a team of heroes out of a shopping mall. Although there are 4 heroes, they're not owned by any specific player. Any player can move any hero. Instead, each player has a limitation on how they can move the heroes. So one player can only move heroes north, one player can only move them south, one player moves west and one moves east, one player can open doors and reveal new tiles, another player can use escalators. A timer is flipped over and players start moving heroes freely, as often as they wish, bearing in mind their limitations of movement. They're attempting to get the heroes onto a matching coloured symbol and then get out of a matching coloured exit, and this isn't easy. The difficulty is compounded by the fact that the players are not allowed to speak to each other. That's right, the game is played in silence. Players may, however, indicate to another player that they need their help by placing a large red wooden pawn in front of them. They cannot say what they need them to do. The red pawn just means do something. There are areas of the board where the team can flip the timer over and discuss strategy, but generally the game lasts for a frantic 15 minutes, after which players will have all won together or all lost together. So what the designer has done in Magic Maze is take out all of the social interaction, clearly, remove all of those mechanisms and instead incorporate a dexterity element where you've got to use one hand, turn over that deck, go through that deck to find the card that you need, use it and then repeat. So there's a dexterity element, there's a racing element, there's a memory element of the order of the cards. And of course, that is a perfectly valid experience, but it's a very different experience to play in multiplayer, and it doesn't really replicate what people love about the multiplayer experience of Magic Maze. So it's a bit of an oddity. It feels like you're playing a very different game in solo mode, and probably not quite as fun a game. That said, you're probably not going to buy Magic Maze specifically to play it solitaire. You're going to be buying it for the multiplayer mode. So it's quite nice that you've got this added little mini game in there that you can sort of dabble with if you want to explore it. A lot of games do try and directly replace that human opponent by having an automated opponent, some sort of artificial intelligence. This is often called a bot. Sometimes it's called an automa after Viticulture. The Stonemaier games introduced this term automa, and the Automa Factory, which is a group of designers or a single designer, I'm not sure, who produces a solo mode for each of Stonemaier games, which is always now called an automa or some variant on that word. A good example of this sort of automated opponent is in Architects of the West Kingdom, which is quite a meaty sort of strategy game to play. In Architects of the West Kingdom, each player is an architect trying to impress the king by building various landmarks. On a player's turn, they place a worker onto the main board to select an action. So they might take wood, or stone, or silver. They might convert resources to marble, or donate resources to gain virtue on the virtue track. They might steal money from the tax stand and lose virtue as a result. They might hire apprentices with special abilities, or collect building cards, which give immediate rewards or endgame scoring. They might build buildings or contribute goods to help construct the cathedral, both of which allow them a place in the guild hall. Players' actions are stronger when they have more workers in any given slot, so their first worker might give them 1 resource, their second worker gives them 2, and so on. And of course this means that large groups tend to congregate on action spaces. Players can use an action to arrest a large group of workers, placing them onto their own player board. And later, they get paid in silver to send any captured workers to the prison, and other players can use an action in order to take their workers back. At the end of the game, players earn points for buildings, for their position on the cathedral, and the virtue track, and for resources and money. And they lose points for unpaid debts, and then the highest scorer wins. In solo mode, you play against an automated opponent called Constantine, or you can play against Helena for higher difficulty. You play as normal, placing workers and gathering resources and building landmarks. But when the opponent plays, they turn over a scheme card, and this tells them where to place a worker and what reward they receive. Some cards add new, more powerful scheme cards to the deck, so the opponent gets stronger actions as the game progresses. The opponent never gains silver or any resources except for marble, which is only used for scoring. And at the end of the game, you compare your scores to the solo player and see who is the winner. Now, the problem with these bots and automas is that they can be quite a lot of bookkeeping. You've not only got to think about what you're doing, you've also got to think about what your automated opponent is doing. And so that can add quite a lot of bookkeeping, quite a lot of things to be thinking about at any given time. So a lot of games use a simplified bot. They don't really focus on, the bot doesn't focus on doing all the things that you're doing. It doesn't have the same strategies that you have. What it mainly does is it acts to deprive you of options, to take away pieces when you might need them the most. So an example is the game Everdell, which uses a simple dice roll just to take away cards that you might have wanted. In Everdell, each player creates a village by laying out cards on the table in front of them. Some represent buildings, some represent characters, and on a player's turn they can either place a worker to gather resources or complete an objective, or play a card. When playing a card, this can be taken from the central display or played directly from a player's hand. Buildings always cost a certain number of resources to play, and characters cost berries, but they can be played for free if the player has a suitable building to house them in. All cards have special abilities, one-off powers, permanent effects, endgame scoring, or unique worker placement spots. And at the end of each season, players gain additional workers and activate many of their cards, so the game has a good sense of progression, speeding up from round to round. And after 3 complete seasons, the players score victory points for the cards in their player area, and the highest scorer wins. In solo mode, you play against an automated opponent called Rugwort. Essentially, the game is played as normal, but Rugwort progressively blocks spaces on the board and collects cards for endgame scoring. Each time you play a card, you then roll a die, which tells you which of the meadow cards to give to Rugwort. Rugwort never pays any resource costs, and he can't use any of the card abilities. When you prepare for the next season, Rugwort takes basic event tokens if he has enough cards of the relevant colour, and blocks certain parts of the meadow so fewer cards are available to you each round. And at the end of the game, Rugwort's worker is moved to the 3-point journey space, and then Rugwort also gains points for cards in his collection, basic events that he's achieved, and also for any special events that you did not achieve. And the highest scorer wins. And another example is the game Wingspan, which doesn't use a dice. Wingspan uses a deck of cards, and so it has some added sort of sophistication to that bot. But still, what those cards are acting to do really is to remove pieces that you might have wanted. In Wingspan, each player starts with some birds and some food. And in this video, I'm using the lovely wooden food tokens I bought separately from Meeple Source. Players are attempting to fill their own personal boards with birds. And on a player's turn, they may place a bird by feeding it with the required food type, and in later spaces by also giving up 1 or 2 eggs. And the birds must be placed into their favoured habitats. Or the player may take food by selecting one of the visible dice results and taking a corresponding token. Or a player may lay eggs, up to the allowance indicated on each bird card. Or they could draw new cards into their hand, so they have 4 actions available. And for each action, you get an increased benefit if you have several birds already in that corresponding habitat. Often, when you take an action, the special abilities of the birds on your board will activate, giving you resources or other game-changing effects. After each player has used all their actions, then the round ends and bonuses are scored for certain objectives, for example having the most birds or having the most eggs in a certain type of nest. And after 4 rounds, the game ends and players reveal whether they've completed any of their secret objective cards. These points are added to the points shown on the birds, and they also gain 1 point per egg, and then the highest scorer wins. In solo mode, you use a player board, but the automa opponent does not. Your turns function as normal, and on the automa's turn, you turn over an automa card, and it takes the action indicated for the current round. Its actions get better and better as the rounds progress, which is similar to a real player in an engine building game like Wingspan. The automa actions remove cards from the supply, or remove food from the birdhouse, or place markers on the end of the round goal board, etc. And at the end of a round, the automa is given a base value as indicated on the card, and it adds the number of markers it has placed. And if that beats your score, then the automa takes first place on that goal board. At the end of the game, the automa scores for end of round goals, for eggs, for face down cards, and for face up cards at their marked value. And you score as normal. Now, we've touched on a couple of times here where games have taken a highly interactive mechanism and they've had to find a way to replace it. So we talked about that with Magic Maze. But there are a couple of really good examples in the game Isle of Cats where there are specifically, direct interaction between players, but you can't get that in solitaire mode. So instead, the designer Frank West has tried to incorporate games mechanisms that give you a similar feel. In Isle of Cats, each player fills a ship with cats and treasures of various shapes and sizes. They're attempting to cover rats, fill rooms, and collect cats of similar colours. And at the start of a player's turn, they gain 20 fish. They then draft a handful of 7 cards, taking 1 card each time and passing them on until all players have 7 cards. The players then choose which of their 7 cards they want to keep, and they pay for these with fish. Any blue cards are played immediately. These are endgame scoring objectives. Players then play green cards to establish turn order and gain baskets. And players then take turns to take cats from the display, paying fish. The cats are placed onto the ship, and each cat requires 1 available basket when it's placed. Some cards award treasures and special Oshaks tiles, which are essentially wild, and count as any colour as marked with a token. After 5 complete rounds, the ships are scored. There are various scoring criteria, matching cats, filling rooms, rare treasures, etc., along with the objective cards you played earlier. In the solo mode, a player plays against a randomiser deck of cards, and each round a card is drawn which changes the turn order and determines how many tiles will be discarded from the display. The drafting is altered so that the solo player now draws 5 cards, keeps 3, repeats, and then takes 1 final card from the deck to make up their hand of 7 cards. The opponent scores points for the cats that are placed on the solo player's board. The cards are revealed gradually throughout the game, indicating which cats are the most valuable to the opponent. And there are 3 objectives placed at the start of the game which score just for the opponent. The solo player competes against the opponent for the highest score after 5 rounds. So the mechanisms I was talking about there were specifically card drafting. So a card drafting system is where you take a card, pass your hand of cards on. Take a card, pass your hand of cards on. So the cards cycle around the table in a circle with you taking a card each time. There's no solitaire mode in Sushi Go. It's not an easy thing to replicate. And in Isle of Cats, what Frank has done is a very simple system where you take 5 cards, you keep 3 of them, throw 2 away. Take another 5, keep 3, throw 2 away, and then take 1 random one off the deck. And that is a perfectly workable system to replace all of that card drafting that happens in the game. And the game doesn't lose that much by doing so. It's simple and quick and easy. I remember a very convoluted sort of replacement for the drafting system in the solo mode of At the Gates of Loyang, which I played many years ago. I can't remember the details. But this is a nice simple system in Isle of Cats. Another thing Isle of Cats does is really tries to give you that sense of trying to deny your opponent. So in a lot of games, of course, I'm focusing on what I'm doing, but I'm also watching my opponent's board and trying to make sure they don't get certain things because I know it's going to benefit them. So in Isle of Cats, your automated opponent has some objective cards, and the things that I do on my player board might score points for my automated opponent. So I've got to keep an eye not only on what I want to do, but also avoiding the things that my opponent wants me to do. And I must say, I found this quite a lot to deal with. Quite a lot to think about, and I found that was quite frustrating for me. But I think that's because I don't really do this much in multiplayer games. I'm tending to focus on what I'm doing and not worrying too much about what my opponent is doing. And that's probably why I lose a lot of highly interactive type games, and why maybe I favour the more sort of multiplayer solitaire games. I'm not a mean player. I don't want to ruin someone else's experience. I feel guilty if I do things to the opponent. I worry about it. So, this sense of denial, it's certainly something that a lot of people enjoy, and I think Isle of Cats does manage to replicate that quite well in its solitaire mode. One thing that I think is useful, we talked about narrative, but the sense of progression between games in solitaire mode. So what I do in one game impacts on what I do in the next game. A few years ago I played the game Pathfinder Adventure card game. I don't have a copy anymore, so I can't show you. But that game attempted to replicate playing a role-playing game, but doing it by yourself. I'm not sure it quite succeeded in that, but you did get the sense of characters that developed and got better and better. You'd actually write on the cards, and you'd meet various characters throughout the game and get to know them a little bit. It was a very sort of sophisticated, simple system, and I found it really enjoyable, a bit like playing a sort of choose-your-own-adventure book. Recently I tried to play the game Star Wars Imperial Assault, and sort of explore the developing sort of campaign in that. Over the years I've played Imperial Assault quite a lot, but only really as a two-player skirmish game, so me facing off against another opponent, and usually my friend Tom, who I play against, knows the game really well, so if I get stuck on a rule, he can explain it to me. And playing this solitaire just highlights how many rules there are. I was going from one rule book to another rule book. There were multiple rule books in the game, and then of course there's a whole other set of rules for playing solitaire. It's all controlled by an app, and so I downloaded this app, and it's got a tutorial, but the tutorial goes on forever, and then once you get into the main game you can't easily get back into that tutorial. I found the whole thing pretty baffling, really, I mean, it's great that that option exists, and I know a lot of people love it, and particularly people who are very experienced with the base game and really understand the rules in and out probably will find that app is really, really intuitive, but I must admit it wasn't for me. I like the simple progression that you see in the game of Agricola in solitaire mode. In Agricola, each player represents a family of farmers in the 17th century. You start the game with 2 workers, and on your turn you send one worker out to fulfill a task. They might collect wood, or they might go and get some clay, or go fishing, or plough a field, which later can be used to grow grain or vegetables. Or they might build fences or stables, so that when you collect farm animals, you have somewhere to put them. And when all workers have been placed, they're returned, and the action spaces restock so they can accumulate a lot of tokens over several turns if they're not taken, making for a better yield next time someone visits that spot. At the end of the game, you're going to score points for having a good mixture of stuff. And you can also pay resources to upgrade your house from wood to clay to stone, or to increase the number of rooms. And bigger houses mean more space for workers. And more workers means more actions per round, plus more points. And each action space can only be occupied by one player, so you have to take care not to get blocked out of a desired location. But the number of available locations increases throughout the game. And at the end of every 2 or 3 rounds, there's a harvest. You take 1 grain and 1 vegetable off each of your fields. You feed your family 2 food each, and you breed your animals. And if you don't have enough food, then you take a begging card, which is worth a lot of negative points. Players also have a hand of cards which can be played throughout the game. These are called minor improvements and occupations, and each one costs resources but gives a massive boost and gives you powers to help you build the best farm. After 14 rounds, the best farm wins. In solo mode, the rules are identical, except that you start the game with no food and each worker eats 3 food instead of 2 during the harvest. Wood is also less abundant in solo mode, only gathering 2 tokens each time it's restocked. The goal for your first game is 50 points, and once you've achieved that, you get to keep one of the occupation cards that you used and retain it for the next game. And in your next game, the points total goes up and you have to get a higher score, but you still get to keep cards each game that you play. If you ever fail to reach the scoring objective as it keeps increasing, then your unbroken run is ruined and you have to start again. You complete the solo series by beating the scoring objective of your 8th game. There you go, some nice simple progression. I enjoyed that special power card I had in that last round. I'm going to keep that card and use it in my next game. But the points that I need to achieve in my next game have gone up. So although I've got a bonus from the previous game, I now have to achieve more. And then in the next game, I can keep 2 cards, but my points bonus has gone up again. Next game, 3 cards, but again, the points bonus goes up. And I have to have an unbroken run. I can't afford to lose any of those games. That's a really nice system. It feels like, you know, you can play this game over days, you know, and develop your strategies, but there's no added complexity there. Another thing that solitaire game designers seem to struggle with is the concept of moving pieces. Moving pieces around a board, you know, actual movement of characters. Imperial Assault was a particularly complex example of that. So the app would tell me this piece is going to move to this position, and it would have a whole load of caveats about which type of opponent it would move to, which sort of terrain. Again, baffling to me. And there was this overarching rule of if you're stuck, or if there's 2 equally sort of valid places for it to move to, it will always move to the place which is least beneficial to you as the human player. Which again loads a whole load of decisions onto me. Like, how am I supposed... I'm not good at this game. How am I supposed to determine what is objectively the most beneficial position for my opponent to be in? So I didn't get on with it, the movement system in Imperial Assault Solitaire. I want to have a look at the game Scythe by Stonemaier Games. I've mentioned before that Stonemaier Games is really innovating with their automa system and developing and incorporating it into every game. Scythe is a particularly complex automa. Let's have a look at how the game works. In Scythe, each player is trying to gain coins, and on a player's turn, they take one of 4 actions. The first action is move. This allows you to transport workers and resources across the map. Or you can produce. This adds new resources or workers onto spaces that you already occupy. Or you may bolster. This gives you more power for future combats. And the 4th option is to trade. And this gives you goods or popularity, but you have to spend coins to get them. You may not take the same action 2 turns in a row. And each action that you take is associated with a secondary action. So these are upgrade, which allows you to move a cube to uncover an additional benefit on your board and cover up a different cost. Or you might deploy. This allows you to purchase a mech, which is great for transporting workers and resources and also useful in combat. Or you might choose to build, and this allows you to purchase buildings which have different special abilities. Or maybe you will enlist. This allows you to select a one-off bonus, but also gives you an additional reward every time one of your neighbouring players takes a certain action. When players take mechs, they also uncover a special ability which now applies to them for the rest of the game. The layout and special abilities are different for each player, and they're very variable from game to game. If a player wishes to move greater distances, they can use tunnels, either those illustrated on the board, or using mines that they have built. If a player's character lands on an encounter token, then they read the card text and choose a reward. And if a player's character or mech lands on a space with an opponent's workers, they retreat to their home base, leaving their resources behind, and you lose popularity as the attacker. If a player's character or mech moves into the same space as an opponent's character or mech, then combat ensues. Each player takes a combat dial and secretly selects how much power they wish to use. They may add a combat card if they wish to bolster this power. Both dials and cards are revealed at the same time, and the highest wins the combat. The losing units all retreat, leaving resources behind, and the winner loses popularity. Throughout the game, players gain stars for achieving certain goals. For example, moving 6 cubes to upgrade their boards, or moving all 4 mechs onto the board, or building all 4 of their buildings, or having 8 workers on the board, or completing their personal objective cards, or winning at combat, or being extremely popular, etc. When one player has achieved 6 stars, then the game ends, and coins are awarded for various bonuses, including those stars themselves, and the player with the most coins wins. In solo mode, the Automa does not use a player mat or any upgrades or objectives. It doesn't produce resources or pay costs or change its popularity at all. You play as normal, selecting an action, placing resources, moving pieces or upgrading your player board. But on an Automa turn, you turn over an Automa card. The green section at the top indicates how the Automa is going to move. This is pretty complex, but it becomes easier with practice. Depending on the unit type, they'll either move towards the spot with the most friendly units surrounding them, or they'll move closer and closer to the factory or to the other player. The Automa then gains other bonuses as written on the card, for example, gaining coins or workers or mechs or power on the track. And finally, the solo player might gain a bonus if they've already uncovered the indicated symbol on their own player board. The Automa card will indicate whether to move a cube on the Automa's tracker card. And when the cube reaches a certain point, the Automa will be able to ignore water from here on when it's moving. When it reaches the first star on the tracker card, the Automa gains a star token, and from here on, the red part of the Automa cards is used instead of the green section for all future turns. And if the Automa moves on to an encounter symbol, it simply discards it. But if an Automa combat unit enters into combat, then the solo player chooses their power level and combat cards first. They then draw an Automa card, and this tells them what power and how many combat cards the Automa uses in the combat. If the player ever beats the Automa units, forcing them to retreat, then the player looks at an Automa card to see how many resources are generated and left on the space. The player gains star tokens as usual, but the Automa gains stars when it reaches certain points on the tracker card, or when it reaches 16 power, or when it wins combats. After one player has achieved 6 stars, the players add up their scores and the highest scorer wins. So I found Scythe difficult reading through the rules. I found it difficult to work out how I was supposed to be moving the opponent's pieces. But to be honest, after a few rounds, I got it. And it made sense. It was actually relatively clear once you get the pieces moving on the board. You know, reading it in the rule books, it sounds awful. But once you're positioning the pieces and moving them around, it is relatively clear how exactly these things are going to go. And there's no edge cases. You don't get into the edge cases like you do with Imperial Assault and have to rely on this sort of overarching, well, the player can decide if you're stuck. I wonder whether Stonemaier kind of recognised how difficult people found that movement mechanism in solitaire mode when they moved on to their game My Little Scythe. My Little Scythe is a much simplified, streamlined version of Scythe intended for families. But they've not only streamlined the main game, they've also incorporated an Automa into My Little Scythe, and the Automa is streamlined too. Specifically, the movement system is much, much easier to learn in My Little Scythe than it is in Scythe. In My Little Scythe, each player has 2 seekers who move around a map gathering apples and gems in order to deliver them to the castle and complete objectives. On a player's turn, they may move, or seek, or make. On each subsequent turn, they must use a different action, so they can never take the same action 2 turns in a row. And if a player chooses to move, then they move both of their seekers and gather tokens as they go. They can also jump across the board using portals if they're near one of those. And if they land on a quest token, they reveal a quest card and choose one of the available rewards. If they land on another player's piece, they have a pie fight, where each player selects a number of pies to throw using a dial. They might add a magic card if they have one, and they reveal simultaneously. The player with the most pies wins. The pie track and friendship tracks are both adjusted accordingly because throwing pies is not a very friendly thing to do. If a player seeks, then they roll dice, which determine where the new resources are placed around the board. If a player chooses to make, then they can convert apples into pies, or gems into magic cards, or a combination of both to upgrade one of the actions on their board for a permanent upgraded action. When a player has completed an objective, then they gain a trophy, and examples of objectives are having 8 friendship, or having 2 upgrades, or 3 magic cards, or 2 quest cards, or delivering 4 gems or apples to the castle, or winning a pie fight, etc. Each player has a personality card which helps them achieve one of these goals, and the first player to gain 4 trophies wins. In solo mode, On an auto-mounty turn, they turn over a card, and this will show where to position new resources, or it might show where to move. In addition, it might give the auto-mounty more pies. And movement for the auto-mounty is based on the indicated paths. Both seekers will always move in the direction which gives them the most resources. And if several paths are equally valuable, then one seeker will choose their path by looking at the available options in a clockwise direction, so A to F, and the other seeker will look for the most valuable option in an anti-clockwise direction, so F to A. If an auto-mounty is ever involved in a pie fight, then you select your own number of pies and then turn over the top card of the auto-mounty deck to determine how many pies they throw. At the start of the game, you'll have chosen a difficulty level, and this determines how many tokens the auto-mounty needs in order to win a trophy. So for example, on normal mode, if the auto-mounty has 4 or more tokens at the start of its turn, it gains a trophy instantly and loses the tokens. For auto-mounty purposes, quest tokens are treated just like apples and gems, they're never resolved. And the first player to 4 trophies wins as normal. Now, having played all of these games over the last couple of weeks and thinking about my own strategy game and what sort of system I'm going to put into place there, what's become apparent to me is that there is no kind of shared vocabulary among solitaire game designers. Everyone's kind of winging it, making it up as they go along and trying out different things, which means there's a huge space there for creativity and innovation. I think in board games in general, these games around me, you know, if you look at one game of a particular genre and then you look at another game of the same genre, you'll find a lot of similarities. Designers have a shared vocabulary of mechanisms. So if I want to do something specific, let's say I want to incorporate a catch-up mechanism, there's probably a mechanism that I can find in multiple games that I can lift from those games and incorporate into mine because it is a recognized solution to that problem. This is something which I don't think we've yet seen in solitaire gaming. There's not enough of them out there. It's a new enough sort of thing that people are exploring. And so there's a lot of room there for that sort of innovation, for that creativity, for that exploration, and to find new solutions to the problems. I've got lots of games on my shelves that have solo modes, and I have no concept of how those solo modes might work. I haven't yet looked at the solo mode in the game Role Player, which is a dice drafting game. So how does dice drafting work if it's solo? I don't know. Role Player has one answer. I haven't yet found out what that is. I don't know where else I could go. Does Sagrada have a solo mode? I'm not sure. Maybe I could look there as well. So you're kind of walking an untrodden path when you're designing solitaire modes for your board games. And I think that's quite an exciting sort of thing. And I'm enjoying doing it with my big strategy game. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please watch some of my others. I've got lots of videos about different mechanisms used in games, top 10, I don't know, solutions to the runaway leader problem, 10 degrees of player interaction, you know, looking at the ways that games work. On my channel, Adam's Board Game Wales. On Twitter, you can follow me at Board Game Wales, and on Board Game Geek, I'm Adam78. Thank you very much for watching. All the best.